Hello again, and welcome back to Red Right Hand Forge. This is Marshall, and in this video we're going to be working on something a bit specific. My wife and I have this set of Wusthof kitchen knives, and we like it, but we've noticed over the years that we really tend to gravitate towards this blade in particular, if it's available and not dirty or in the sink somewhere. It just feels good in the hand. It's a good multi-purpose blade, as long as you're not going through anything really heavy or bony. This tends to be our go-to knife. It's just easy to maneuver, it's light, it's really thin, which is going to be a challenge, but I think we can pull it off. One thing I know I'm not going to dive into is you've got that grafton edge on there, these little scallops along the edge that you see. Supposedly those are designed to create little air pockets if you're going through a very dense material. I don't know, I've never really done the research on that, so I don't know how true it is or how effective it is. But I've used lots of blades that don't have that with success, so I'm not super worried about not being able to recreate that. Or I don't know, maybe I could recreate it, but with the equipment I have, I just don't think I could do that with the level of precision that I would like. And I'd probably be disappointed with it being uneven or something. And I'm trying to make something beautiful as well as functional. So yeah, we're gonna skip that. But other than that, we're gonna try and stay with this general profile and shape. Incorporating our own design elements, specifically in the handle. My wife had some ideas about that, and we'll give it a try and see how it comes out. I will be working with stainless, so it's a little bit more of a precision build. But if you're curious about it and you want to see how this comes out, stick around. All right, let's get at it. So a blade with this profile, this is called a Santoku blade, kind of a traditional Japanese all-purpose kitchen knife. And I'm just tracing out the profile on this piece of 440 stainless, and hopefully I'll get two blades out of this piece of steel. So I'm cutting it kind of close here. I'm just going to use the angle grinder to hack off the big chunks. I'll also do some relief cuts to cut around the contoured areas. Just makes it a lot easier than trying to turn the angle grinder as you go through it. And then once you get pretty close to our lines that we've drawn out, I'll take it over to the grinder and finish the profile there. So we wanted a lot of color in this handle, so for at least part of it, we're going to be using this stacked felt to make a felt micarta. Never done this before, so I'm kind of winging it. But the idea is just to saturate this with 2-part epoxy and then put it into a mold. I've got a 4x4 mold there, and these are 4x4 squares. They came from Amazon at that size, so I didn't have to cut them or anything. And I'm just using some packing tape here to create a slick surface so that the epoxy doesn't stick to this piece of wood, which I'm going to use as a sort of press
to compress it into the mold. Now that's a deep pour epoxy, and it takes a few days to completely cure. Or maybe I wouldn't have to wait that long, but I'm just being safe since it's going to get right into being cut and sanded. So I want to make sure it's really hardened up before I mess with it. So while that's happening, I'm just continuing on the steel here, using the digital caliper to make sure that my pin placement is uniform and spread out across the handle right where I want them. Not really following the exact pattern that was on the knife that we're kind of emulating here, but it is important to me that they're not staggered as they go along the length and that they are spaced out correctly. So it's best to be precise here. So as you can see, I'm using the surface grinder to take off some of the mill scale and to thin the blade out a little bit. But I'm also using it by putting an angle on this platen. I can very precisely create a distal taper. So we want this blade to be a little bit thicker in the handle material and thin as it goes towards the tip. So that's what this is all about. Now, since this is already such a thin piece of steel, I'm not going to grind any bevels into this until after the heat treat. And when it comes to heat treating, stainless is much more particular. In this case, it's 440C stainless, and that's going to heat treat at 1875 degrees Fahrenheit. We're going to hold that temperature for 20 minutes, and then we'll take it out and air quench it between aluminum plates. It's good, of course, to clean your blade thoroughly. We want to make sure all the contaminants are gone before we get it in here. And you'll also notice that I'm using a little piece of paper, and the idea is that if I make an airtight pouch with this aluminum foil, this is in kind of an industrial grade. I don't know exactly the thickness of this foil, but this is way thicker than like kitchen aluminum foil. Just you'll have to buy this special for heat treating. But at 451 degrees Fahrenheit, shout out to Ray Bradbury. That paper will combust, and then supposedly the idea is that we'll eat up whatever remaining oxygen is in that pouch, assuming I've done a good job sealing the edges here. And pulling that oxygen out just helps keep from building up decarb and scale on the blade as it reaches those really high temperatures. After we do the air quench, it'll go into a tempering process, and that's 350 degrees for 2 hours, and we'll do that twice. And you can see here we're going to try and quickly take it out of the oven and then press it between these aluminum plates to dissipate that heat quickly. Now, despite our best efforts, you can see that we've developed a little bit of a warp in the blade after heat treating. So I'm going to try something I hadn't used before. I built this hammer. I should have made a video for it, but I didn't. But I made this hammer a couple weeks ago. This is a straightening hammer, and it's basically a solid carbide ball bearing that I've embedded into the tip of this ball peen hammer. And the carbide is so much harder than the steel, than even this hardened steel. The idea is that you tap it on the inside of the curve, and that actually stretches the steel of the blade out. You can see the little bearing that I've put in there. That's a 3/8 solid carbide bearing. And after you hit it about 600 million times, you can see the little dots here when I turn it to the other side. But you hit it enough, and basically it stretches the steel on the short side, and it kind of evens it back out. And you can see I kind of went up and down from edge to spine and in the places where the bend was. And then you can see there was a couple places there, but really worked. It takes a little while, but it's very precise, and I'd never done that before. I don't know where I saw that first, so I don't want to give credit to anyone where credit isn't due, but a lot of people are doing this in the knife making world, and if you haven't tried it, I highly recommend it. So after a few days, this epoxy in the micarta is set pretty good, and we're ready to take it apart. One thing I learned in this process is that the epoxy will tend to darken the micarta a little bit, so it's best to err on the side of brightness if you really want those bright, vivid colors. Still very happy with the way this came out. It's real solid. I think the colors look nice. It is a little tricky if you're trying to get certain colors to show and others to be deeper in the pattern. Unless you do a lot of precise measuring before you start this process, it's kind of hard to know exactly where you're going to sand down to and what colors are going to actually be the prominent or outside colors. I really like that gold that you see there, and I guess I kind of regret not putting that somewhere in the middle of the stack, because I pretty much sanded that almost completely off, and I was left with, well, you'll see the end result. I think they look great, but if I had known ahead of time, I probably would have arranged those colors in a way that would have allowed me to kind of predict which ones are going to end up on the outside. But anyway, we'll set that aside for now. And at this point, I haven't taken video of all of this because it's just so monotonous, and arduous, but basically just lots and lots of hand sanding. And we still have a lot of hand sanding to go, but right now I'm putting my benchmark on. This is an electrochemical etch process. I use the Personalizer Plus system, which works really well. I don't like to put this on at the end for a couple reasons. One is that, well, you can see there's like little dots, almost like 4 corners, just outside of the benchmark. And no matter how I tape these things up, I can't seem to avoid getting those dots on there. If you're watching this and you have a technique that works, I mean, I've tried taping with electric tape in all different configurations and patterns, but it seems like it always managed to get those little dots on 4 corners. So for that reason, I like to make sure I'm not too far into the hand sanding process before I put that benchmark on. And this will allow me to sand away those little dots while still leaving the predominant benchmark. But this goes on for quite a while. And if you notice that the micarta that we made, it's only 4x4, so that's not going to cover the whole length of the handle. So we're also going to couple that with a piece of stabilized wood. I don't know what kind of wood this is. It's been laying in my hardwood stack for quite a while, but as you can see here, I've got it in the vacuum chamber. I'm using cactus juice to stabilize this, and that's going to fill in all the voids and turn it into a nice solid piece of material to shape and work with. And I'm hoping that light color will be a nice contrast with the dark colors that we get out of the micarta. That goes in the oven to cure, and then we get back to hand sanding for a few thousand years. Now, I made a little bit of a mistake. I thought I had the camera running when I didn't, but I actually have laid in some bevels. It's a little different when you're working with a kitchen knife. Generally, a kitchen knife doesn't have a real defined plunge line. I suppose there are some exceptions to that, but usually it's just kind of a gradual, right into the tang. There's no ledge where it goes from bevel to tang. And to accomplish bevels on a blade like this, what I did in this case was to put it in a vertical orientation on my belt grinder with the flat platen on there, and I just dragged it from one side so that the edge is the last to leave the belt. And what you end up with is basically a taper from the spine to the edge, and it gives you a good, a nice edge geometry. What we end up with is about a 0.25 millimeter thickness just behind where the edge is going to be laid in, and that's pretty good for a kitchen knife. Now, if you're making a full tang blade and it's got scales like this, it's very important to get these shoulders pretty much finished before you do the glue up, because once it's all put together, it's virtually impossible to access this little area where the wood or whatever handle material you're working with, where it meets the steel. it's really hard to sand that, or impossible to sand that without scratching the steel, and then you have to go back and fix that, and it's a big hassle. So best to finish this as much as you possibly can before you put it all together, and it'll save you a lot of trouble. Now, one thing you may have noticed is that I've drilled a larger hole for the center pin and the tang, and that's on purpose. And if you've ever tried to glue up a handle with knife scales and 3 pins, you'll know that it's a bit of a struggle to get those to line up perfectly. I've been doing this for quite a while, and I still have a really hard time, no matter how precise I think I'm being. But with that larger hole in the center of the tang, it allows that middle pin to float around a little bit, so you can line up your outside pins perfectly, and then that center pin will just kind of find its way. Now, as long as you fill that void completely with epoxy, you have a solid mechanical connection. So I probably should have mentioned this earlier, but whenever you're working with this 2-part epoxy, make sure you're protecting your lungs and your eyes, because this stuff is really nasty. You don't want to be breathing in the fumes from this when you're doing the glue up or when you're mixing it together, and you don't want to breathe in these particles when you're sanding and finishing. You can take my word for it or not, but this is what happens when you don't heed those warnings. This handsome fella right here is me a couple years ago when I didn't know any better. This could have been from rubbing my eyes after getting it on my hands, or breathing the particles and having an allergic reaction. I really don't know, but it took me a while to figure out what was happening. But that's the result of not protecting yourself and wearing proper gear when you're working with this caustic material. So learn from my mistakes. I sanded that up to about 800 grit before this is just a little boiled linseed oil I'm wiping on here just to get a look at the colors and to see where the voids are. Whenever you're working with a micarta, you probably know, you're just going to run into things like that. They're basically little dry spots where the epoxy didn't completely penetrate whatever material is in the micarta. And that can create little voids or just little light spots. I'm not really concerned about the light spots, but the voids are, they don't feel right. You know, it just makes for kind of a bad finish. So what I'm doing here is just flowing CA glue over the surface of the entire handle. And then once that sets, I'm going to sand that down again. And it works really well, but it's not an easy process. I have to do this about 6 times before I get all those little pits and voids filled in, and I'm satisfied that I have a uniform, smooth finish all over the material. If you're willing to put the work in, micarta is wonderful. It's virtually indestructible, and it looks great, but it's a tough one to finish, at least in my opinion. That's my experience. Once I'm satisfied with that process, I'm just kind of rubbing it down with some ultra fine steel wool before I take it over to the buffing wheel here. This is just a clean buffing wheel. There's no compound on here or anything. It works really well for that super glue finish that we have on there. It shines up nicely. So here's the finished product, all cleaned up and battle tested. This was a lot of work, working with stainless and trying to follow a specific design and profile. It definitely took a lot out of me, but I really enjoyed this process. I hope you enjoyed watching, and if you have any questions or comments, you know where to leave them, and I'll get back to you. Thanks again for watching, and I'll see you on the next one.